Starting with our first speaker, who needs very little introduction, I assume, in this community. Tamarinde Have, Assistant Professor of Research Methodology in the Social and Behavioral Sciences at Tilburg University, combining philosophy, psychology, epidemiology in her work on research integrity, responsible climate, responsible supervision, open science, and many more. I guess many of you are very familiar with her work. Really looking forward to this talk on work you've been doing a bit of a while ago. The floor is all yours. Please, Tamarinde.
Thank you very much for such a kind introduction. So, welcome everyone, continuing this session and continuing our discussion on a slightly conceptually different topic that I'll say a bit more about in a minute. Because for the next 15 minutes, I'm inviting you to join me on a little journey through this river, where at the start of the journey I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the landscape looked like when I started my PhD back in 2017. And I'll say a bit about how I define the research climate, and then I'll walk you through a case study, if you will, of the academic research climate in Amsterdam, focusing on some results that I hope can be thought-provoking enough, also for the rest of the discussions that I hope that we're having collectively. And I'm going to end on two small pilots that we did based on the insights that we gathered from that case study, and then I'll also point a bit at what I think the future is going to look like of investigating the climate. When I talk about a research climate, this is the kind of definition that I have in mind, and I want to in particular bring your attention towards two things. So first, if we talk about the shared meaning that people in an organization attach to the events, the policies, practices, and procedures they experience, that's really a bit of a fuzzy conceptual way of saying, what are people's perceptions? And the second part is, beyond perceptions, what kind of behaviors do they see around them, right? Because whether we like it or not, to continue what Rose already mentioned this morning, we are affected by what we see around us, by what we see is stimulated by a system, what is also recognized as normal, or this is the way things work around here. So if you want to get a grasp of the research climate, which we wanted to get from the academic research climate in Amsterdam, those are the two things I'm going to focus on. So let us first look a little bit at those perceptions. And we did this through survey research, where we invited all the academic researchers in Amsterdam to take part. At that point, we still had 2 university medical centers and 2 universities. And we asked people using this validated measurement instrument called the Survey of Organizational Research Climate about their perceptions of the research climate. And the survey looks both at perceptions on a full institutional level, but also a little bit more local on a climate level. And what you can see here, and what's important to know, is the more positive, or the higher the score, the more positive people generally perceived this research climate to be. And I think you may have already noticed a little bit of a pattern. I'm going to highlight it for you for 2 particular subscales. First, supervisor-supervisee relationships. What you may notice is that the people who are typically the supervisors, namely here in the light green, the associate and full professors, they tend to think of this a little bit more positively than maybe the people who are on the receiving end of the supervision, namely the PhD candidates who are in dark blue. And we see a bit of a similar perception when it comes to integrity socialization. So this subscale asks about, okay, when you joined this department, were you socialized into the things we do in this department to uphold the standards of research integrity? Again, this is typically a task we assign to the seniors. They seem to believe they do rather well overall, these are averages, whereas the people on the receiving end seem to at least be a little bit more skeptical. And we saw a similar pattern when it came to people's perceptions of publication pressure. So this was an instrument that I helped co-develop, the publication pressure questionnaire, the revised version, when we inquire people's stress levels when it comes to publishing, really how pressured do they feel. their attitude regarding the current publication climate, and also the kind of resources they have available to potentially mitigate those pressures and threats a little bit. And here too, it seems to be the case that there's not one uniform climate happening in Amsterdam, and at least the way that people perceive this research climate differs depending on where they find themselves on the academic ladder. So that's about the kind of perceptions that people have regarding the organizational policies and procedures. Let us move on to the kind of behaviors. Something else we did was we presented, again, all researchers in Amsterdam with different behaviors. And I put one up on the slide here. They could be dubbed sort of questionable research practices, major and minor research misbehaviors. I'll leave the terminology to you. And then we asked them two questions. First, how often have you observed this in your own sort of environment in the last 3 years? And then we asked, if you were to observe it, how much of an impact does that have on the validity of the research results? And here reasoning that if you see things very rarely, they may not be worth to be the center of our attention. And on the other hand, of course, we do want to take into account how terrible they really are. So we combined those. And what we then did is we stratified these different behaviors per disciplinary field, because we wanted to get this sense of, okay, what kind of behaviors, right? What kind of behaviors do people see around them? Do they see rewarded, expected, being normalized? And this is what really struck us. What we found was that regardless of the disciplinary field, the behavior that researchers in Amsterdam were most concerned about was the quality of supervision. Regardless of their disciplinary field, this was something that they saw both being rather frequent and that they also thought was rather impactful ultimately for the research that we as institutions produce. The other behaviors were a little bit more mixed. They could be characterized as various versions of sloppy science, but we definitely also saw some common elements and overlap. Here it's about maybe a particular sort of personal bias that people were concerned with. Then another one could maybe be to really be at the sort of faulty end of choosing the apt measure when it comes to really developing and carrying out your study. Sitting on this data, something that we were wondering about is, okay, we have an environment where we see all of these research misbehaviors happen. There's a difference in how frequent they are. To what extent does it matter the kind of climate that people sit in? To what extent does it matter the kind of publication pressure that they perceive for the kind of behaviors? So in other words, to what extent can these climate factors and publication factors explain the variance in these perceived research misbehaviors? And that's what we set out to do with this particular study. And as you can see, there's 3 different clusters of factors here. And what I mean with individual factors are really just demographic characteristics. So academics, gender, their academic rank, their disciplinary field. The climate factors are those on the first slide, right, where we ask people's perceptions about the research climate. And the publication factors refer to the publication pressure questionnaire that I shared with you earlier. So what we found was that if you were to add these kind of individually, we can see that individual factors explained about 7% of the variance. When it comes to publication factors, about 22%. And publication factors seem to explain about 16% of variance in perceived research misbehavior. But we don't pretend that these factors exist in isolation, right? We think that they really all supposedly interrelate. So here we sort of cumulatively added them, which means that we left the individual factors in the model and then added the climate factors to it, and then added the publication factors to it. And here what we really see is that the cluster of factors that seems to have that seems to carry the greatest weight is really that of the climate factors. Because you can see that if you have the climate factors already in the model, people's perceptions about publication pressure seem to affect it less overall. Is it then still worthwhile to add all those factors? Absolutely yes. If you compare the -2 log likelihoods, there is a substantial increase in how much is explained by adding these factors, but it does kind of push us in a direction of trying to think about, okay, how can we then improve this climate? How can we get to a potentially better climate, given that that is the cluster of factors that seems to have the greatest effect? And we tried to come to something of an informed answer through conducting focus groups with, again, academic researchers in Amsterdam. And we invited researchers from different academic ranks, different disciplinary fields to sit with us. We also presented the results as I'm presenting to you today, and we asked them, think with us, what can be done if we really want to improve this climate? And there were 3 things, and I'll focus on 2 here. One of them was, if we really want to build a more responsible research climate, we should get better at discussing expectations. And this is a beautiful example from a professor of the social sciences who's alluding to the fact how some of her colleagues are already very conscious in what kind of expectations they convey. And they try to reflect critically on their own behavior in what kind of implicit and explicit expectations they set also for their PhD candidates. Another thing was that researchers thought it would be worthwhile to think of ways in which we could improve the quality of supervision that is happening in our particular institutions. Can we boost, can we equip supervisors with better interpersonal skills and maybe also better research integrity skills, because they are ultimately seen as the role models for a new generation. We tried to take those insights into the development, the co-development, I should say, of a small training for research supervisors. This training is called Superb Supervision, and we did a pilot evaluation too of this training. So I want to highlight these are only pilot results. And it's a 3-day program where we really try to focus both on their interpersonal skills development. So we have them do exercises having to do with how do you give feedback? When do you use feedback and when do you use coaching? What is real listening? And I'm sure there are plenty of people in the room who thought, my supervisor never really listened to me. As well as, what kind of responsible research practices can supervisors actively encourage and maybe also role model towards their PhD candidate? Is it appropriate in your field to pre-register? What's a good data repository given the kind of things you do? And again, you don't need to have all the knowledge as a supervisor, but it's great if you can help your PhD candidate navigate that kind of landscape. And we evaluated that using both survey results, where we inquired the perceptions from the participating supervisors and their PhD candidates. They did seem more positive overall, both about interpersonal skills, but also the responsible conduct of research and dexterity. But the other thing, which I think is perhaps more interesting, is we also conducted focus groups at the end of the supervising training. And here we found that people were generally excited about the content of our training. They thought it could be a little bit more synergized, maybe even. And despite the fact that they were uniformly blown away and pumped and wanted to share these kind of trainings with their departmental members, they said, don't make it compulsory. We'd highly recommend it, but don't make it compulsory. Because part of what we really benefited from is that you were able to create a positive learning climate for us. And if you're going to bring in a lot of people who are super unwilling and who really don't want to be there today, that's going to take away part of really the foundation that we need to really critically also look at our own behavior. Something else we did, continuing on that discussing of expectations, is another pilot where we used a technique called moral case deliberation to work and to apply it to research integrity dilemmas. So moral case deliberation finds its roots sort of in clinical ethics support, where we got groups of research teams to work with us, and we would co-lead these kind of sessions where we would discuss an actual dilemma that was currently playing a role in their practice. And we also evaluated this, and you can imagine it was quite sensitive for them. They did it with us, we also learned, they learned, but it was quite sensitive for them. And then when I did interviews at the end of that pilot project with the different participating members, Something that they really appreciated about this technique and about really critically examining the different perspectives that played a role was this idea of really deepening the kind of insight into the perspective of the stakeholders that played a role in the dilemma, that played a role in the case. And I think it's much more beautifully addressed in the words of the participants, actually. So this is one senior researcher who was a head of department, and I think this is beautifully showing the inside of what this kind of interventions can do, who is reflecting on the fact that it was helpful to really take this bit of a step back, and without immediately wanting to come to a solution, also recognizing that he, in this case it was a him, as a head of department, wasn't always the best person to immediately come with a solution, right? Sometimes good leadership also really means stepping back, not giving the solution, and letting other people come with it. And secondly, and this is from a more junior person, who's elaborating on the fact that when initially the dilemma was presented, it was really not obvious to her why the bad person in the case was doing this. And through systematically dissecting the case and seeing the kind of norms and values that were involved, it became much easier for her to empathize also with the people involved in the case. So concluding my talk, if we look into the future of a responsible research climate, there are two particular directions that I'm hoping that we're going to explore more and that I'm also partially personally involved with. One of them has to do with the fact that, coming back to my own definition, if we really want to see what kind of behaviors people are engaged in, we should study those directly. We have Tom van Drimmelen here, who's doing beautiful, fascinating ethnographic work on studying how researchers make decisions in practice. And another person that I want to call out is Tracy Weisgerber, who's going to speak on the symposium of the Dutch Reproducibility Network, and who's done a lot of work in screening the publications of researchers, right? Because that could also be a really interesting way in looking at behavior more directly. And another thing is that I think we should move beyond diagnosing maybe the bad factors and trying to think about what interventions are out there and which are worth scaling up, and how do we do that in a systematic manner, in particular when it comes to wanting to promote reproducibility. And that's what the iRise consortium is actively looking into, as well as Tier 2 and OSIRIS, but I'm personally involved in iRise. And iRise 2 is going to, together with Tier 2 and OSIRIS, is going to share the overview of reproducibility interventions on the 6th of December. So please come with us and help co-shape a future where we have evidence-informed policies that can strengthen the research climate. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamarinde. It was a beautiful talk again. I have a question on the superb supervision, and then specifically on whether this should be on a facultative level or if it should be obliged. I mean, when you did your study, that was a couple of years ago, do you still think that it should be facultative? Or are we at a moment now that we maybe have to say, some of the people are just not coming to these sorts of courses and they need it the most. Now we need to use the stick.
Two reflections. And they can maybe add the sort of nuance. The first is, I think it can be made facultative, but it requires really, really high quality trainers. And I know, and I've had the privilege to work together with some people who were capable of doing that, who could get a full room of unmotivated supervisors and still work with them. But I think we can all feel it's only very particular people who possess those kind of skills and that level also maybe of, like, call it social charisma, call it stamina or whatever, that can really do that. So I believe it can be done, but then we really, really actively have to invest into the level and the skills of the trainers that we put in front of that audience. And we often don't. We just go for sort of the first bit. The other thing is, when it comes to mandating things, I think an argument can be made that indeed we're now a couple of years further, and maybe a certain level of knowledge is something that we could mandate that also all supervisors need to have. But our training had this really beautiful mix of both knowledge, but also wanting to change people's behavior. And for that, you know, considering the first point, you need really good trainers, but also really good trainers are benefited if people come that are willing to look at their own behavior. And that are not going to sit there and make the atmosphere hostile for everyone. So I think when it comes to mandating trainings that are ultimately about behavior change, that's something we should be very, very, very cautious about.
Of course, I have a follow-up question on this. Because this was also triggering me, and I've heard several people already today saying, well, the next step in our organization, and it's also the next step at Amsterdam UMC, actually VU has mandated it already. So we are now in the stage of implementing trainers for supervisors. So how, if we look again at the pyramid that Yuri and others have shown this morning, the first step was making it mandatory, making it required.
No, the first step was making it possible.
Making it possible, yeah. So, so is that definitely a no-go then? Because I think making a change does require more than this. So I'm still a bit skeptical about, that's what the findings were of the participants, but...
So there's a difference between the finding of participants when it comes to a pilot study and when it comes to a sort of a full study. So having that nuance there, I am willing and I'm actively pro exploring a future where we mandate this. But I think then also on an institutional level, it's going to require very strong leadership to be able to cope with the kind of resistance that's going to come from mandating anything to academics, right? So it's going to require university leaders who are willing to embody that change, to harness that resistance, and I think we have some fantastic candidates for this in the Netherlands, but it does require really a concerted effort at many levels of that organization, and not the least the full leaders at the top.
Okay, yeah, and then now we need to continue our discussion with Rachel, I think, to see how we can actually do this by teasing people more. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Tamarinde, and that was really interesting. It's Irene here from University College Cork. Just in terms of the supervisor training, so it was just supervisors that you were training. Have you gone down the road of maybe having those kind of interactive workshops between supervisors and supervisees, or even PIs and their teams? We've done some of that with a digital badge where we've had so different cohorts, different career stages in the one room, and anecdotally, the feedback we get is quite good in terms of motivating supervisors and things like that, because they hear the other perspective. But I suppose just in terms of how we kind of formalise an evaluation as to the effectiveness of that, I'd be interested to hear, have you done any work on that kind of training?
Yes, I have. I am hopefully at the end of this year, the NRN Happy Hour, going to present work of myself looking into responsible supervision, also how we can ultimately measure responsible supervision, where I think it's going to be vital to look both at the self-reflections of supervisors, but also at the reflections, perspective and experiences of the PhD candidates they lead. So that's coming up, and I've definitely done work on that.
And also, just on terms of mandating and or not, I think we all can kind of share that. I suppose one of the reservations we have of mandating is that when it comes to research culture, what you really want is to people to really see the value of this and something that they want to show up for, because we believe that then it's actually going to sink in more, and people see the value as opposed to being a stick. Also, I'm in University College Cork, and we're known as the rebel county. So when you mandate things, automatically your people's backs get, you know. But so just in terms of having the carrot, have you looked more into ways of actually people saying, we really want to do this, as opposed to you have to do it?
Yes, so the training is currently still being run at the University of Amsterdam. And what they do there, for example, is that whenever someone who has the kind of aspiring PI status gets a big grant, the university HR services reach out to them and they say, fantastic, congratulations. Can we help you by offering this kind of training so that hopefully you can lead the people that you're going to hire on this grant more effectively? And I think that is one of the kind of carrots that we should be looking at.
Okay, thanks.